Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of my Barbarian leveling progress. If you haven't seen part 1, be sure to check that out as it covers the first 15 levels of my Barbarian leveling, my thoughts surrounding the early game skill allocation, experimentation, item upgrading and enchanting, and more. Now, it's important to point out that everything shown here is prior to the 1.1.1 balancing patch that came out yesterday, which buffed a bunch of skills, items, and resource generation for barbarians, among other classes, so the experience shown is not going to be 100% the same as yours if you were to start now, so just keep that in mind. We're continuing this little saga with my barbarian at level 16, making my way through the back half of the seasonal questline, and like most 16-year-olds, it felt like some experimentation was in order. Now that I had a few item upgrades and a few more skill points at my disposal, after a small redistribution of points from HOTA to Whirlwind to see how it would feel at this level, I decided it felt far too slow and underpowered at this point, so I opted to give Upheaval another try, although I pretty much immediately gave up on that as it just didn't feel good at all either. So on to a new one that I hadn't tried yet, Double Swing. It only took a couple dozen kills before deciding that this also just simply didn't feel good. Whirlwind was the only skill that I knew would eventually be satisfying once I had enough gear and synergies to make it work, and none of the other skills seemed both remotely powerful or enjoyable enough to want to stick with in the early game, so it was back to Hammer of the Ancients for me. Now, back in town, after salvaging some of the junk I had recently collected, I experienced one of the weirdest Diablo bugs that I had ever seen. My camera was still fixed on the blacksmith even though I had left the blacksmith UI entirely, so I was able to move around freely at this point with the camera in this awkward fixed position, was able to stop at the vendors and shop, but I was also unable to move my character outside of the FOV of the camera, which made for a pretty funny few minutes during which I noticed that I had a little reward satchel from one of my recent seasonal quests, and after opening it, I got my first rare ring, which had an insane collection of stats: crit damage, crit chance, and vulnerable damage. Not too shabby for level 17. Although unfortunately at this level, crit damage and crit chance aren't as good as you might think, simply given the fact that I don't have other items with those stats, so the crit chance is going to be insanely low, meaning that I'm very rarely going to be hitting crits, making the bonuses to crit damage largely irrelevant. Either way, I was happy to have my first rare ring. Now I also happen to have one of the decent pink hearts left over as well, which reduced the resource draining effects from my enemies and increased my resource generation, something that I'll gladly take, especially prior to the 1.1.1 patch that would be buffing resource gen for Barbs. Eventually I went back to the main menu and logged back in with my Barb, and that remedied my camera issue, and after returning back to Kyovashad, I immediately did what everybody should be making a habit of, regularly checking the vendor stock, as it's not incredibly uncommon to find insanely good items for sale at the vendors. They usually restock in the ballpark of 50 minutes to an hour, I don't remember exactly, but either way, you're going to want to be sure to always check all 3 vendors, including the jewelry salesman. Now, in my experience, this habit is actually most fruitful in the late game, when your character is like level 85 and up, as the items are regularly over 800 item power and sometimes have incredible stats. I've actually bought items from vendors for 500 or 600,000 gold that I either end up using as best in slot endgame gear, and other times I've even instantly turned around and sold the same vendor items to other players for 10 million, 20 million, or even more. Now, having this nice new rare ring gave me the opportunity to finally make use of one of the most important early game codex aspects, the aspect of Echoing Fury, which makes my shout skills generate 2 fury per second while active. Now, when I was leveling my first Barb in the preseason, the significance of this aspect was lost on me. A couple of fury per second didn't really seem that exciting. But if you think about it, we're currently using 3 different shout skills, each of which lasting for 6 seconds. So with even a minimum roll of this ring from the codex giving us 2 fury for each of 3 shout skills for 6 seconds, that gives us a total of 36 fury, which might not sound like a lot, but coupled with the fury that we generate from hitting enemies with lunging strike, the fury and fury generation boost that we immediately get from using rallying cry, as well as the resource generation we just got from socketing that heart into our new ring, our resource management just went from 0 to 60. Without any 1 or 2 of these things, we would be swinging our basic attack 1 or 2 more times every time in between each of our HOTA swings, massively slowing down our damage output. And speaking of damage output, I opted to throw on the aspect of the Expectant onto one of my one-handed weapons as well, which works nicely with this build as it increases the damage of my next HOTA hit every time I use Lunging Strike, which I'll still be needing for Fury generation, so I can turn this Fury generation process into a damage generation process as well. I thought for a moment about throwing a legendary aspect on my two-handed mace, but quickly decided not to, as this was currently my primary weapon and I would likely be swapping it out a ton pretty much every time I get any DPS upgrades on it for quite a while, so it wouldn't be worth spending the resources right now. Now, I did mention last time that I have a ton of extra resources left over from leveling my rogue, so they're not a massive concern for me at the moment. But you don't want to make a habit of imprinting every single rare that you get in the early game, as you'll eventually be out of resources and constantly have to choose between upgrading items and losing the legendary aspect on your existing inferior items, or never getting a chance to use these upgrades in the first place. So you really want to think carefully about when to imprint versus when to not. Ultimately, any items you don't expect that you'll be replacing anytime soon should be considered as candidates for imprinting first and foremost, and even then, that decision should be based on the number of crafting materials and gold that you have available. There really is no one right answer to this process. You're simply going to have to find the right balance that works for you, but make sure that all of the items that you grab, you're either selling to vendors or salvaging at the blacksmith. Now, after hopping back on my horse to continue the seasonal questline, I realized the game had defaulted me to using that spectral horse skin, which just didn't seem right for Grandpa Joe. I mean, look at him. So I felt I had to make a quick pit stop to the stable to swap to something a bit more class appropriate. As soon as I got into my first engagement with a group of skeletons, it became instantly apparent how much my Fury generation had improved from literally just minutes before. Take a look at the Fury globe on the left from earlier and the one on the right from now, and you can see the massive difference. Already at level 17, with just a couple of codex aspects and a few new items, the build was genuinely feeling like it was coming online. My character was moving quick, and HOTA was hitting hard and often. I eventually picked up another pair of rare boots, but the increased armor and other stats simply didn't matter as much to me as my current pair of boots that have a brief 30% movement speed boost when evading, which is just simply too convenient in my opinion. But shortly after this, I remembered that weapon expertise features were available to me at level 15, and I was reminded that you need to do a quest to unlock this, so that became my next priority after the seasonal questline, through which I progressed and ultimately got to the Varshan fight. Now, he's got quite a lot of HP compared to most of the enemies in the game thus far, and regularly buffs himself with a barrier, so it's super important to maximize the damage I do to him by regularly applying Vulnerable using Steel Grasp every few seconds, as well as in between ensuring that I fill up my Fury Globe as much as possible before every hit with HOTA, as if you recall, its damage scales with how much Fury I have when I cast it. After making short work of Varshan and finally finishing the seasonal questline, I nabbed a one-handed weapon upgrade, making me immediately regret imprinting that one-handed mace with the expectant, lesson learned, and also grabbed a new rare amulet that came with a Fury cost reduction, damage reduction, and most importantly to me, as we all know and love at this point, movement speed. Even though I was going to be replacing the amulet that I previously imprinted, that lasted me 5 levels of character progression, providing me a ton of value throughout that hour or two of gameplay, so I don't regret imprinting it at all. Like I said, it all comes down to how long you reasonably expect to be making use of that item before upgrading, and in this case, the resources were well spent. I then made my way over to complete the Barbarian class questline to unlock the full expertise system features, during which I leveled up to 18 and started to invest points into the Wallop passive, one of the most important passive skills for HOTA builds, which increases the damage of our HOTA attacks massively when enemies are stunned or vulnerable, the latter of which should be very often right now and basically 100% of the time in the late game. Now, speaking of damage to vulnerable enemies, I know that my HOTA build is going to want to be making use of the two-handed axe expertise, as that further boosts our damage to vulnerable enemies, but up until now I haven't used a two-handed axe at all. So after finishing that quest, I decided to swap out my two-handed sword to a slightly worse two-handed axe, and then to set my basic attack to use this two-handed slashing weapon, leading me to take a little bit of a hit to my attack speed and damage, but serving as an investment in the long term, to begin leveling my two-handed axe expertise, eventually up to level 10. Now, even with this slightly less optimal change, combat was still feeling very good at this point. Also, friendly reminder to make sure that you take your XP potions. Now, anyway, I nabbed an upgrade to my chest armor and continued on with my new objective, making progress on my remaining renown by completing some dungeons that I hadn't yet completed, as this felt like the most efficient thing to do at this point in my leveling process. If it hasn't become obvious at this point, I'm avoiding any boosting or meta speed leveling on this character. I'm trying to play as quote-unquote normally as possible, as I think this is the most genuine experience that most people will have, and honestly, speed leveling guides are a dime a dozen anyway, so if you wanted to see that, you wouldn't be watching this, you'd be watching one of those. Now, on my way to one such dungeon, I came across my first treasure goblin, and I want to use this as an example of one of the major reasons why I prefer lunging strike as my basic attack. It's less about the strike part and more about the lunging part. Simply by clicking on him when I'm within a close enough range, which is actually quite a bit further than you might expect with a melee attack, My barbarian literally locks onto him, automatically following him no matter where he goes and whatever direction he goes, rapidly lunging directly to hit him, which is insanely useful in combat. Getting a hang of this feature of lunging strike not only will make it so that you'll never be outrun by a treasure goblin ever again, but also as an incredibly useful tactic during combat with large groups of mobs, as between that and your evade, you can move extremely fast in between different enemies within the group, making a class that can feel slow and sluggish actually feel quite fast and nimble. Now while in the middle of running this dungeon, I hit level 19, putting one more point into Wallop. I will use this as an opportunity to give you a little bit of a taste of how I'm playing this build, as even before level 20, it's beginning to feel a lot like it will in the endgame, which is to say, enjoyable and satisfying. Combining rapid movement between lunging strikes and evades, with steel grasps to group up enemies in front of me for a single massive HOTA hit, I make pretty short work of even large groups of mobs, ultimately turning them into a mound of paste. Now the reason why I chose this dungeon in particular was because it's the dungeon that's going to unlock the aspect of Ancestral Force, literally the most important aspect for all HOTA builds, as it turns your relatively small, targeted hammer smash into an amplified, much larger AoE attack, damaging people all around you and even behind you, something that you'll see in the next episode. Now, right as I completed the dungeon and unlocked this aspect in my codex, I hit level 20, the next major milestone in my journey. Now I hope that you're all enjoying this little series thus far and want me to keep it going. And I wanted to extend a massive thank you to everybody new and old that's subscribed to the channel, as we just hit 200,000 subscribers, an insane milestone that I'm super grateful and humbled for. Thank you all for the kind words and support, you're all legends, and we'll see you next time.